Good evening, everybody. Hello, I'm Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm editor for Live Journalism based in Washington. It's my true pleasure to be with all of you here tonight in New York to hear a discussion about one of the most pressing media issues in our political culture. Our event tonight is part of the TimesTalks series, live conversations between New York Times journalists and the brightest and most innovative minds in politics, policy, film, art, business, and technology. I would like to give a special welcome to our New York Times subscribers, and thank you for your role in making our journalism happen. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome 3 journalists with front row seats to our most powerful institutions and their narratives. Andrea Mitchell is NBC's network chief foreign affairs correspondent and host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. Bret Baier is the chief political anchor of Fox News and host of Special Report with Bret Baier. And Norah O'Donnell, co-host of CBS This Morning. Here to interview them is someone who knows our bifurcated media world very well. He's a veteran political and media reporter who writes a column on the latter for the New York Times. So please join me now in giving a warm welcome to my colleague, Jim Rutenberg, and our special guests, Andrea Mitchell, Norah O'Donnell, and Bret Baier.
Hello there. Thanks everybody for coming on this rainy night. I also want to thank our panelists, 2 of whom came from Washington, D.C. to be here, Bret and Andrea, and Norah came from Washington as well. We see some network representatives in the audience, and I just wanted to tell them no coaching from the sidelines, please. The no coaching rule. I, on the other hand, have many coaches.
Was this it, Andrea, right?
We might get to that topic down the line.
As long as you're not a thief.
No, well, it depends. I'm a scoop thief, if I can be. So you may have noticed last week we ran a little op-ed that was maybe anonymous. So though this isn't quite on topic, I feel like we have to get that elephant onto the stage here. Yay or nay? I'll just go down the line. Whether you have published it or not, and why?
That's a tough question. It's really newsworthy. I wish there had been a little bit more transparency about the category or identification. Senior administration official is very ambiguous, deliberately. But I think it's very important to hear inside voices from the administration, and there's so much respect for the New York Times that we all assume it's a high-level official and that it was someone properly vetted.
Norah?
Yeah, I think it's worthy of publication. I think Andrea and Bret and I have all covered Washington and know that, senior administration officials are as ubiquitous as senior vice presidents on Wall Street. And so look, and by the way, that's why in reporting we do something more than a single source. We get multiple sources because someone can have a motive, someone can have an opinion, a beef. But it did speak to some of the concerns that some of our additional reporting has had about the president's actions. And so I think it kicked off a conversation, and it continues to be relevant. The only thing I have about our reporting, and I just was with the FBI director today for his first big extensive interview, is not
good tease.
Yeah, it's not just whether you wrote it or not, but the question is whether you agree with some of what was written in it, whether that's something you've seen yourself. And I think that's incumbent on us as reporters to say, well, was there a discussion of the 25th Amendment in cabinet meetings? That has not borne itself out, at least in our reporting at CBS News. Do you see a president who is not, who is essentially amoral? And some of the things that were laid out in that article. But I think having not known all the particulars, I think it's worthy of discussion.
And did Director Wray say anything about whether he would investigate the origins of that op-ed?
So as you know, President Trump has tweeted and said on Air Force One that he wants his Justice Department to investigate who wrote that memo because it is an issue of national security. Director Wray said it was something he would look at, but at this point he has no time, not time, he is, long day, but he is not currently investigating it. I also asked him because Vice President Mike Pence said on Fox that he would be willing to take a lie detector test. And I said, is that something that the FBI would administer? And he says, well, that's what we do at the FBI. We do lie detector tests. So the FBI director's motto is keep calm and tackle hard. And this is one of the administration officials who is sticking to the facts, sticking to his job, and is not getting involved in the political fray.
I had U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, on, and she wants to make sure that you all know that she was not the anonymous writer. She said a couple of times in the interview.
Mark Felt said the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
She even wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post to that point.
She did. I agree with both Andrea and Norah that it was very newsworthy. But I do agree with Andrea that I wish that the scope had been narrowed on the source. And I understand the reasons for not doing that, but had it said top 100 officials or senior administration officials, as you know, could be somebody 3 down at the EPA. And so I wish it had a little bit more narrowing on the sourcing, but clearly it started a conversation and it tracks other reporting that all of us have seen and done.
And time to the Woodward book, which is very specific, time, place, not name, but the actual conversations that he reports, it does support a lot of Woodward's conclusions.
Right, and Woodward said that he would perhaps not have published it because he wanted more specificity.
Right.
I, on the other hand, was on vacation last week, and so I can't really...
You get to skip out of this question?
I'll save it for a column. No, no. Actually, I always have a problem with anonymity in general. It's like one of my things when I write my column. So, but it did start a conversation and made some news. So, but really, what we're here to talk about is our bifurcated news environment. And it's a complicated topic. Media is all-encompassing. It means a lot of different things. We all work at news organizations that have slightly different bents, right? So this week, to me, that every week there's a great example of the difference in how we cover things, right? And this week, it's a smaller story boiling out of the Russia investigation, and that is these leaked emails, or not leaked emails, these emails that a congressional committee has released, right? Mark Meadows released, that were text messages between the FBI agents, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and they talk in 2017 about a media leak strategy. And what the congressman who is in charge of releasing these, Mark Meadows, said was, this basically, could be evidence that they were trying to leak anti-Trump messaging in 2017. And the Democrats countered that no, they were talking about, in fact, DOJ internal discussion about leaks to the media and how to crack down on them. The lawyer for Mr. Strzok said the same thing. And the way we all covered it was very different. We at the Times didn't do much with it. The president did tweet about this. MSNBC didn't really cover it. NBC didn't. CBS didn't. Fox in prime time did like crazy. But here's what I want to make a note about Bret's show. Bret's show covered it as a news story because that's what Bret does. Bret's show is a news show, and those who don't watch it, I recommend you do because it is a news show in its own right, and it played it right down the middle. But my question is that said, part of the population that watches Fox is seeing heavier coverage of this, and it's feeding for Trump or Giuliani, his lawyer, or whoever. It's the idea of, is this investigation corrupted? Is it infused with such bias that you can't pay attention to it? Again, not Bret's show. This is the opinion makers at night, especially someone like a Sean Hannity. Then our readers don't even know about it, right? And ditto your networks. So my question is, and I want to start specific, and we'll get super broad as this goes on, but how do each of you approach covering Russia, in this Russia investigation, in terms of what's responsible, what's not responsible, what's fair, what's not fair?
Well, speaking for myself, and I'm on NBC and MSNBC most often on my own program during the day, which is a news program. So I try to stay in that lane. I've done this for 40 years. Now, that said, it has become more challenging in this environment because you have a president who's talking about us being the enemies of the people. You have a very hostile environment. There was always, I think, an appropriately adversarial relationship. I started covering the White House, as a backup in my youth in Jimmy Carter's White House, and then 8 years of Reagan, and then was on the Hill, and then back for the Bill Clinton first term, a good bit of the first term. So I've been in and out of this for a long time with different press secretaries, both at the State Department and the White House primarily, also on the Hill. And there's no president who likes a lot of the questioning. Obama would say that, both Bushes would say that. But previous presidents have appreciated the relationship, the appropriate relationship, understanding that there are tensions. And previous press secretaries, for the most part, there were some big exceptions in Reagan and in Nixon, in some of the early Reagan years. Previous press secretaries have appreciated the importance of representing the White House as well as the president, and of sticking to facts. And what we now have is a much more adversarial situation from the top down. You have a press secretary and others who feel that they have to, at least in public, no matter what they say privately to reporters, perform for an audience of one and show how tough they can be. And you have deliberate misstatements from the economic team, from a lot of other teams, from people at all levels. And that creates a problem because as a reporter, you can't just say, the president tweeted today that this is the greatest economy ever, that this is the greatest president since Abe Lincoln, that the Gettysburg Address was, dealt with fake news until history finally said it right. You cannot simply repeat these presidential documents. Tweets are important. He fired Rex Tillerson on Twitter at 8:40 on a Monday morning. Believe me, I know. I wasn't at work on time. And
I find that hard to believe, Andrea.
These things have to be taken seriously, but in context, and we don't have to jump at everything he says, but important things are said. And so I think that puts an obligation on us to call it out when it's not true. And that puts me in a place that I had not willingly been in before, on a constant basis. So that has created a different atmosphere. And I think it's unhelpful. I think it's really unhelpful for democracy, for the President of the United States to create this enemy of the people, fake news meme, and for reporters to be threatened and called out from the podium at rallies from the campaign on and since. And it creates a hostility that is truly dangerous. People then go to their corners. And that's what we're seeing is there are too many niches. There are people going to one opinionated cable network or another, and to find their own set of facts becomes harder and harder, and people are not, I think, as willing to listen to other points of view.
Right.
Well, I think to your point about Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, there are some news organizations that have to spend some extra time introducing their audience to that, even though it was in the Inspector General's report. It's clearly a news story, and it becomes perhaps more so when the president tweets about it. That said, the president tweets about a lot of things, and I'm always one tweet away from changing my entire show, at 5:55. Right. But I think to your point, you have to give a hat tip to some in the middle of the country that look at this and say, if something's not covered, is that also suggesting that the media is not fully dealing with what I care about? Whether opinion shows are mouthing off about something, you kind of have to say, here's what we know about this. Here's what Democrats on the Hill say, Republicans say. Here's what the facts are, and then let them decide. It sounds like a lame slogan, but really that's the mindset that I'm going from at 6 o'clock, is that we're going to put it out there. Viewers can decide what they think about it. And it's tough. I mean, sometimes I feel like an ice hockey goalie trying to stop the bad pucks from getting through. Right. And there's a lot of bad pucks. There's a ton of stuff on Facebook and online that is just out there.
Right.
And go ahead.
It is more important than ever that those of us who are journalists and believe in objective truths to play the role as referee in all of this information. And we ultimately believe that reporting all of that is important. I agree with Bret. I actually think what Peter Strzok texted to Lisa Page, and the fact that they were having a relationship, is incredibly newsworthy. It is also newsworthy, important for all of us as informed citizens to then read and trust what the Inspector General from the FBI then reported about that. And to my two good friends here, correct me if I am wrong, sorry, three good friends here, but I know they cover this as, yeah.
I'm just
But you're moderator,
it's
so that's...
Yeah, you're moderator.
Under no illusions.
What then was, what the Inspector General then, admonished Comey for announcing this investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, but also said that while what Peter Strzok did was wrong, that it did not influence and there was no partisan bias within the FBI. And that's incredibly important. All of us have families and organizations. There are bad apples in our families. There are bad apples in organizations. They do not necessarily, that one person does not speak the entire integrity of that organization. And I think that's the point that certainly, long-serving public servants at the FBI are trying to make. Did Peter Strzok text some wrong things? Yes. And other people do wrong things. But what does it speak about the entire conduct of the FBI? And so I think we need to use the broadcast that we have and the reporting that we do to put things in context and to play referee on that point. And I think as Bret sort of put it in that, that's because we are reading more and talking to more people than anybody else. That's our expertise. And so I say every morning when we do our broadcast, sometimes when we just repeat what is a tweet or repeat what someone has said, I said, hold on a minute. We're referees in this. Let's let people know what we know and provide context. And that's how we have an informed electorate, and that's how we have a functioning democracy.
And I just want to say, just parenthetically, what I did not know when we first got into this was Peter Strzok's background, that for 10 years he was in charge of one of the most important counterintelligence operations our country has ever had. The so-called illegals, who were the prototypes for the Americans, who were followed and tracked from Toronto when these Russians went undercover, and then went to France, came to Harvard, and by the time they were at Harvard, Peter Strzok was in charge of tracking their every move, their every drop, and I didn't realize that there was a reason why he was even placed in this investigation from Mueller's perspective, because he was the expert on undercover operations against Russians who would become moles in America.
So if anything, he had a bias from his background, which was, and maybe not an unfair bias, but meaning that he knew what the Russians had been trying to do for many years.
And he had an expertise in going after the MOs of these Russians.
Right, and that's a story that the texts are, they're not in context, so it's awfully. Now, Bret said something that I've thought about a lot since my earliest days of covering media, when I met with Roger Ailes and early in Fox's, kind of as maybe 3 years old as a network. And I think Ailes really was onto something, that there was part of the country that did not feel like the Times or the broadcast networks were speaking to it, right? And he said there's going to be an opinion aspect of Fox that will do what it's going to do, but we're going to have a news division, and it is going to be rooted in news, but it is going to approach news in a different way. It's not, I think it's funny because it was like this pre-9/11 mindset. So Ailes would talk about a religious story or the death penalty, that the network news, in his view, would always be outside where an execution was going to happen in hushed tones, and in his view, not everyone's anti-death penalty, and that tone is wrong. Obviously, things continue to morph, but I'm wondering, and I'll start with Bret, but then I'll work down the line, because Fox did a certain thing, MSNBC did a certain thing, then the broadcast networks had to react. But so from Bret's standpoint, how does the original Ailes approach to news, not opinion, still influence what you do? And I think you almost answered it just now when you said, the middle of the country, you're thinking about what they're going to be missing if they don't see it on the news.
Right.
I'm using that term loosely. Right?
Sure. Listen, I think that we saw in the election that there was clearly a disconnect about what people thought about leaders in Washington. As I traveled the country before the election, the biggest thing I heard was both parties suck, and kick the table over and try something different. That, in some of the polls and how we covered the election, was lost. I mean, even as I was sitting on the anchor desk on election night, we were ready to call the race for Hillary Clinton at 10 p.m. based on exit polls.
So was President then candidate Trump, right? But still.
And so I think it does factor in to our thinking in that maybe this isn't a story every place else, and maybe it isn't on the front page of the New York Times. But for somebody in Omaha or Oklahoma, maybe it matters. And there is a choice that you make in what you cover. Obviously, you're covering the news of the day and the biggest breaking stories, but then there are other stories that you make choices on. And we try to acknowledge some of the thinking that sometimes gets forgotten.
Right. And then Andrea, you made this point, you're NBC News, but you're also your daily shows in the MSNBC umbrella. Your lead-in can sometimes be very opinionated. So do you feel like the NBC sort of approach, which is not quite counter-programming, but at night certainly, but during the day, maybe increasingly in other day parts, how do you feel like you fit and how are you influenced by the footing of the network?
I mean, during the day, we are a news cable network, and I fit in very comfortably with my colleagues. We report the news, we do breaking news. Very often I cut away, certainly if the president is speaking, if we were wall-to-wall with the Kavanaugh hearings last week, we carried President Obama's speech, as did all three of the cable networks. So during the day, we have a lot of interruptions. The president's lengthy photo opportunity, remember when he brought both parties in and they were negotiating DACA in front of us. It was fascinating. And we had leaders from both sides, and they came out of,
Oh, that was great.
the cabinet room, and supposedly there was a deal, which didn't last very long.
Yeah.
So all of this is live and uninterrupted. But every day we work very hard to get the biggest guests and to write very good background material, and for me to work on my questions, and we do mostly foreign policy and politics, because that's what I love and that's my wheelhouse. Right. And so it is basically the same kind of straight reporting I do on any other newscast. Prime time is different, there's no question about it, and Rachel has her own, really authentic voice, deeply reported, though. I mean, we know a lot of stories break on Maddow because she has incredible research and attention to detail and digs for documentation. And the same, certainly with Chris Hayes, who's won all kinds of awards, and others who are in prime time. And then Brian has carved out this wonderful arena to bring all of our print colleagues on at night and talk about what they're breaking. And so much has been breaking after 6:30, 7 o'clock, so that everyone in prime time is basically throwing up, their shows. So I don't see the big bifurcation. We have the same standards. All of our shows are lawyered and standardized to the point where, certain things are just not said, and we have guidance on anything that is either too violent, too sexual. Mm-hmm. It was a little bit challenging at times during the campaign with this particular candidate, but I think we have to edit and make sure that we are not offending sensibilities, and whether it's at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning or 10 o'clock at night.
Right, something social media does not have to do. And Norah, I want to tell the audience that you were at NBC before you were at CBS, and you were there. You were on.
She's the one that got away.
MS. So what's
Andrea and I's offices were right next door to each other. Yeah, for many years.
And we worked together.
Yes, and we covered the Pentagon together, and Bret and I traveled many miles together with Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Let me say this. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but everyone is not entitled to their own set of facts. And the interesting thing, and Andrea and I have worked together at NBC and MSNBC. We both lived in that world together. And so I watched the growth of a cable network from a news channel, an all-day news channel, and then to which largely has become a channel, especially in prime time, which is based on opinion, which is also what is true in Fox. And those channels have a business goal and make money in different ways, but their audience is largely driven by reinforcing people's opinions about something. What we do at CBS This Morning is we try and just report the facts. We are not in the business in reinforcing people's opinions. And there's incredible journalism that goes on in prime time on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, but there are also a number of commentators and hosts who also infuse with a lot of their own opinions. And so what I think all of us have to examine, and I do it all the time, is when I read a story, when I watch something like a US Open match, is my initial reaction to that a bias? I'm checking myself constantly about what that is. And so I think all of us as informed citizens have to look really deeply about when we watch something, because gosh, it feels good to watch somebody who says the same thing that I feel, because I'm mad and I'm really angry and I don't really like this person and it really, really bothers me. But it's hard to spend the time to sit down and learn the facts about a particular story. And lots of times if you learn the facts about a particular story, it might shift your opinion just a little bit about why this person is in the news, why they did what they did, and also having respect for the institutions that are carrying out investigations. I happen to be a big believer in public servants and those. I trust the institutions of government, many of the people that do that, even though we constantly report on them and hold them account, as the First Amendment allows us to do, and James Madison talked about holding them account. That's the whole point. But I think there are many good people in public service in our government. We hold them account to account. But that's just my thinking, is how I've been thinking, is about trying not to always view something that's reinforcing a bias that we might already have.
I would just say, the only thing I would say in slight variation there is that a lot of our primetime programs, since this investigation has started, really are populated with former prosecutors who are not opinionated. In part. They are former FBI officials, former assistant US attorneys, and they are explaining what happened in court today. They're basically telling you, this is what happened, I sat in the they're reporting. They're basically, I was in the Manafort trial, this is what the judge said, this is where I think he was favoring one side or another, this is what is likely to happen in the next trial. So there is a lot of actual information that is being imparted that is not just reinforcing people's opinions in this context.
Sure. Andrea makes a good point about when it says underneath them whether just a former Republican strategist or whether they're actually a former U.S. attorney or something. It's important to read the chyron,
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't sugarcoat it, though. I mean, it comes from a point of view, right? And when the opinion shows go, they are coming from a point of view. And I mean, I know they cover things that are breaking, and they have experts that are really good.
I just mean if they have expertise in a particular area, the legal experts, the FBI officials, I think that they're not.
They're legitimate, of course. And
they're credentialed, let's say.
Listen, I have the highest respect for Rachel. I think she, as a broadcaster, lays things out like Schoolhouse Rock sometimes and takes people along.
Just a bill.
Yeah, and now some of the conclusions are different than folks in the middle right would think are the conclusions that they get to. On the flip side, Sean and Tucker and Laura, they are great broadcasters because they do what they do, but they are obviously opinionated. And they're very, forward-leaning in what they do. And that's a different thing than what I do.
So notice that Bret is using the word broadcasters. And there's a difference between broadcasters and journalists. And that's a distinction that viewers, should be aware of.
Well, Hannity says I'm not a journalist. Once he said he was, I get confused. But one thing about those two shows is that the people who watch them, Sean Hannity's audience will be furious if Mueller comes down with some Russian collusion charge or obstruction, and they're going to see it likely, and this is his core audience, as a travesty. And Rachel's audience will be furious if Mueller has none of that. And this is where the twains don't meet,
But there's
right?
a reason why.
That's why you should watch CBS This Morning.
Or NBC Nightly News.
And coming up next on CBS.
The advertisements
Or
aside,
TimesTalks, streamed live on Twitter.
there's a reason why people on one side will be furious if Mueller doesn't deliver. And that is a reason that goes to the core of what has been inappropriate from the Oval Office. Because we have not previously had presidents of the United States of either party talking about ongoing investigations. Now, there's no question Ken Starr they were beating the hell out of him from other advocates in and out of the White House, in and out of the political party. But we did not have presidents of the United States speaking and calling something a witch hunt over and over again to the disagreement of senators in his own party. And that is what I think has changed the atmosphere about this Mueller investigation.
Well, your question, and I think in the whole premise of this discussion is incredibly important, which is Andrea just set up as well, is that we're heading towards a constitutional crisis. Assuming that the special counsel, after this lengthy investigation, lays out Robert Mueller, decorated Vietnam veteran, Marine, 12-year veteran, is the head of the FBI, consummate professional, is not a show horse, he's a workhorse, is going to present something that may include some really stunning stuff about the behavior of the President of the United States and whether or not, and collusion I think is a little bit of misnomer about what he may be looking at. I think that's, but we're heading towards a constitutional crisis where it will demand action by members of Congress, it will demand action by certain areas of the government about what to do next with the President of the United States. And that puts a special, I think, responsibility on journalists about how they will treat that news that comes from the special counsel.
If the
I
report
agree
is
that
public.
if it comes out and if it heads that way, if it doesn't deliver, what will be the reaction for people who have been calling for Mueller to really drop the goods? If he stops short of that, and maybe there's a tangential indictment here or there, but it's not what people think should happen. But then what happens?
There may not be a report that is public. I mean, technically, the report goes to Rod Rosenstein unless he has been removed, or to whoever's the next Attorney General, who will not be recused, and it either does or does not have to go to Congress. I mean, it could die within the bowels of the Justice Department if that is what happens. So there is not
Either way, it's a crisis, but to your point, but it's possible that it doesn't deliver.
And that brings me to the question that has been coming up, I think, for really the last year, is if Watergate were to happen in this environment, what would it look like, right? Would the president have had to resign? And I think that's an open question.
Well, let me say something about the difference. The difference with Watergate, which took a long time and without social media and the velocity of what's happened tonight, it took one newspaper largely, a long time and under attack from the high.
No, what one newspaper? Yeah. What was it called?
Yeah, and under tremendous pressure. So it was a long time before other people joined in. But the difference was that you had a House of Representatives where a House committee ended up voting articles of impeachment with Republican votes, with William Cohn, a freshman from Maine, House member, the deciding vote under huge pressure. You had a Congress that understood its role as another co-equal branch of government. You had a Senate which had a bipartisan, investigative committee and produced real results. And that, one fears, if there were real corruption here, would not be the case. We have seen no sign of any backbone in Congress and no sign of any leadership willing to take on the White House. And it's supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, but that, I think, would not be the case.
Which makes these midterm elections that much more interesting and consequential.
Absolutely.
But Bret, do you think if Nixon had had Hannity at his back, Rush Limbaugh at his back, because let's not forget, Rush Limbaugh is very important. Talk radio remains super important, and I think it's overlooked a lot. But do you think the outcome would have been different? Like, do you think it's changed?
Maybe. I mean, maybe the president would feel emboldened that he could continue the fight. And if that happened, you would have a situation where it would be prolonged, and you could have a fight that a president is under siege but still in office.
It was Hugh Scott, Barry Goldwater, and John Rhodes who went to the White House and said, the gig is up.
Right.
You have to resign. All Republicans.
There's something else that's different too, and I think many of us were on what was called the Straight Talk Express. Before McCain, when Bush ran in 2000, and I was out with him in Iowa, and I was on the bus with him, and he would say, "You guys are just the filter. I don't want to talk to the filter. I hate the filter. You media, you're the filter." Well, there's no filter for President Bush. For President Trump.
Right.
There's no filter now for President Trump. He has Twitter. So he can communicate directly to the American people. So his voice travels the speed of social media.
Right.
That enables him in a type of power that didn't exist in the past, presidential power, which is that medium of Twitter.
Right, and your network was key, right? Cronkite was a key part of the early Watergate coverage, right? And now you're at CBS, right? It's a very different dynamic.
Well, and Andrea can probably speak to this a little better, but but think about how we used to organize. Even when I started out, it was largely the 3 newscasts for the most part. I mean, I'm even a baby of cable news. MSNBC, I was there in the beginning years of MSNBC. CNN kind of existed, but MSNBC, when it started, was called America's Talking, and it was actually run by Roger Ailes before he left, and then Andy Lack and others ran MSNBC. But that was the beginning of this whole cable news baby, which was trying to sort of find itself. But this president in particular has understood the showmanship of having been 14 seasons of Apprentice, of using the power of social media to communicate directly with the American people in a different way. In some ways, that has made the traditional media, meaning those journalists who may fact check what is said, less powerful.
Right.
That has made those who hold the megaphone more powerful in terms of directly communicating.
And if you look at the poll numbers for media, there are a lot of people who say that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But again, to Norah's point, the president goes over our heads. Mm-hmm. And the issue is if we don't know it, if we don't know what Mueller's going to bring, we can't get to a journalist saying that Paul Ryan should start impeachment hearings as a Republican.
Yeah.
As journalists. Yeah. I mean, you can have fact, and this is where it leads.
And are you seeing that happening?
Well, I think it creeps in to cable news coverage. I do.
I don't see any sign that the organized Democratic Party wants to talk about impeachment. They think it is really bad for midterm politics. I think it's way too soon. We have to wait to see what Mueller produces. Right. And we don't know that.
Now, Andrea, what was it like to cover, you've covered Reagan and you're covering Trump. And in the Reagan era, was your reporting, did you get anything near the blowback from A, the president, and B, the public and his supporters who didn't like what you were reporting?
You know, it's funny. People, I don't think, realize just how much Ronald Reagan kind of enjoyed the fray. And he kidded with us. I remember one time Chris Wallace, or it may have been Sam, but I think it was Chris Wallace, shouted out something. It was Chris, because he was working with me then at NBC, and he shouted something at the president wearing one of his really, really ugly tan plaid suits. And he's, something from the Rose Garden to prompt a reaction, get him to pause, and then you would ask him a serious question. And we got back to our little cubicle, little NBC booth, and the phone rang, and it was the president for Chris saying, "I checked. This isn't a new suit, it's an old suit. I've got a date inside." And Chris, of course, being Chris, said, "Now, while you're on the phone, Mr. President." Yeah. But, I mean, we had, this president is Trump, very accessible, or it certainly was, stops, talks, went, at photo opportunities more often than not. I had a lot of pressure at times. I mean, frankly, at one Iran-Contra news conference, I got back to the booth, and I had a call from the chief of staff, Don Regan, cursing and screaming at me and threatening to get me fired. And as a result of a question I had asked at the press conference, they had to put out a correction. This is what the president meant to say. And they put it out like right at 5 of 9. We were going off the air at 9 p.m. This is prime time in the East Room. And I just grabbed that piece of paper. I was the number 2. Chris was the number 1. He was out on the lawn on the air with Tom Brokaw. And I just ran as fast as I could and got down on my knees and just handed him this. And, you know, and Regan just read me the riot act. And what had happened was, and this is also classic President Reagan, he called on me, and I was not one of the big shots in the front row in those days, but he called on me, and as I started to get up, and believe me, I've looked at this tape a lot, a gentleman from the New York Times sitting in front of me jumped up and took my question. Who was it? Steve Roberts.
Oh.
I don't hold grudges, guys. So he got up and took my question, and in those days,
I would never do that. You know, I would never do that.
You would never do that.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, a 30-minute news conference. It's prime time, and so, and at the end, Helen Thomas said, "Thank you, Mr. President," and he said, "Well, wait a second, Andrea, I owed you a question."
Yeah.
That's Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
It's why he was so popular with the press corps. He was a gentleman. He tried really hard. He got some things wrong. You know, his presidency almost collapsed under Iran-Contra. But with the advice of some friends, including a Democrat, you know, Bob Strauss and Nancy Reagan, they brought in Howard Baker, who was superb, you know, majority leader from the Senate, and they set it right. And Brent Scowcroft and others, you know, produced a great result. And it was a consequential presidency. So much was done on arms control. And it's one of the reasons why it was one of my best experiences as a journalist.
I wrote a book about Reagan, 3 days in Moscow.
An excellent book.
It's available on Amazon. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it is, right? Yeah.
But in that, to interview a lot of officials, including Marlon Fitzwater, who was the press secretary, and to Andrea's point,
a darn good one, too.
He said every time that a reporter would yell a question like Sam Donaldson, "What do you think, you know, how can you," and he'd be walking back to the Oval Office. And Marlon would get in there with the president, and he'd say, "Well, what was he yelling? Well, let's get an answer for him and figure out what we can do." And so he always wanted to win the reporters over. Right. He wanted to, like, make sure that they knew that he respected their question and he wanted to answer them. This president doesn't want to win the press over. He wants to roll them over. He wants to bowl them over and kind of deal with Twitter.
Now, by the way, I haven't found a way to do this seamlessly, but Bret and I made President Bush hate the media more.
True.
In 2007 on a trip in Mexico where we woke him up in the middle of the night because we were drinking in the courtyard of the hotel.
That was not a story I thought was going to be out.
I never heard that story.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, right?
And how did you hear that you woke him up?
The staffers told us the next day that it wasn't cool. But whose expense account paid for buying out the bar that night?
That's a really good question. But back to opinion program.
But Bret, you talked about something, and this is the poll numbers, the press's poll numbers. And Chuck Todd wrote an op-ed that many in your shop were angry about, but and that's not the point of the question I'm going to ask, but Chuck Todd wrote that the media's poll numbers are bad, and we have made our self-inflicted wounds. We are responsible for some of it, but there's also been a long-running campaign against the press. He laid it at Roger Ailes' feet and said that this is 50 years of people from the Nixon era. I think he also mentioned Limbaugh. But so A, if you want to argue with that premise, please do. But also the question is, he says, therefore, the press now needs to argue back against the attacks against it. That we're programmed not to do that, but maybe there's a campaign being run against us. Do we have to run a campaign back? And that's just not what we're programmed to do. And I'm sure you each have very different views of that.
I don't like to be the story. I want to cover the story. But I do think that we have to defend ourselves. I agree with Chuck that this has been an extraordinary campaign, and it has reached a level where it is actually physically dangerous for our colleagues who are out about covering some of these rallies.
And this is part because I was at the FBI today with the director, but we reported on this last week that the FBI foiled a plot against the Boston Globe, a man who had called more than a dozen times and said he was going to go into the newsroom and shoot up the newsroom, and he was calling them the enemy of the American people. And the FBI foiled that plot. So I asked the FBI director today about threats against journalists, and I said, are there more active investigations about threats against journalists? And he said, we have more than a half a dozen open investigations right now. So I do think that's a very serious thing. I went into this profession because my father was in the military and I care about what happens in the world, but as I've done this job, I realize how important the role of journalism is as a check on our government, you know? And, as I sat there with Andrea and watched Andrea always put a microphone in somebody's face to ask a tough question, we hold these people accountable by the questions they ask. Ronald Reagan was interested in the questions that journalists asked, I think part because he was a gentleman, but also, well, what do they want to know? And I think that anybody who's in the arena, whether you're in government or whether you're in a corporate office, you should be willing to take tough questions. You should be willing to have a check on your power. That's accountability. That's kind of basic accountability. So, to just kind of wrap that up, the role of the press, I think, is more important than ever. And those of us that, have the viewership that we do and the platform that we do, that responsibility is more important than ever to make sure that we cover the facts. We try to do it as impartially as ever. We defend ourselves, but we're not the story. We're part of the story, and we should defend our profession.
Okay, so I agree that I never want to be a part of the story. I never really want to be the story. I also agree that I hate the term fake news. It is in the eye of the beholder. I hate it because I hate that the president could think something is fake news because he doesn't like it. I hate it that it goes both ways. I hate that. I hate the term enemy of the people about the media, and we've said that. And we've stood up for access for others. We've on the news side, have done everything we can to stand up for the journalists of Washington. That said, here's where I think Chuck puts the onus on Roger Ailes, and obviously Rupert Murdoch started the network with Roger. They started the network because there was this niche audience who didn't think that they were getting represented. The niche happened to be half of the country. And that was before any stirring up. It was before anybody was batted down. There was just a perception that people weren't being heard in the middle of the country. I think that this election showed that there is a disconnect. And you have to be able to filter your own filter. I don't think it's the job for journalists to be fighting and to be, aggressively fighting. I think the job for journalists is to present and then let people decide. And if you can't make that determination, you should be an opinion show. And it should say on the bottom, here's my opinion, and I'm fighting and I'm mad as hell. But I don't think that a journalist should be in that role. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I don't love navel gazing, but in terms of our profession, but if you look at the Russian influence campaign and what we were concerned about in the 2016 election and what we're concerned about in the midterms, it is, by all accounts, by every intelligence and law enforcement agency, is an effort. It is called information warfare. It is an effort to sow discord and disunity among the American people. The FBI director said they're not sure yet if they have tried to interfere in our infrastructure, meaning voting rolls, in 2018. But this sowing discord. And so now you have, which is very quietly going on, the FBI coordinating with Facebook and Twitter and feeding information why Facebook is finally, after years, taking down what are Facebook pages and Instagram accounts run by the IRA. Am I saying that right? The Russian
Internet Research
yes,
Agency.
Internet, right, not the
In
Irish
St. Petersburg,
IRA. Yes.
not the one in Florida.
The Russian troll farm that is sowing this discord, and that is fake news.
Of course.
That is. Now that term gets misused, but what you have is now, because of people's predilection to like news that reinforces their own bias, and then these Russian troll farms, knowing who those people are, feeding it to those people who already have biases, it's then drawing us farther and farther apart. And I think we have to look at that. That is a serious intelligence operation. It is an attack against the United States of America by another country. And everybody's got to wake up to it.
And it has been acknowledged by all of the intelligence officials. It is not acknowledged by one person in the Oval Office, frankly. And today, John Bolton and Dan Coates jointly announced sanctions against several countries if they interfere, preventively, prophylactically, announced sanctions against countries if they interfere with our midterm elections.
Which Congress has been begging them to do.
An executive order signed by the president, though.
Yeah.
He had a part.
No, exactly. But if you asked him about it tomorrow, or if you read a tweet tomorrow, he might not acknowledge that.
He did say in the interview with Jeff Glor on CBS, though, that he had addressed that, even despite what the president said on the stage in Helsinki, which some considered embarrassing, that he did not hold Putin to account on that stage. He did say later in interviews that he did privately address the issue of election meddling with Putin.
And one thing, though, that those accounts are doing.
It doesn't, we're
It says
just
here,
talking
let
straight
There's
on.
no record of the private meeting.
Yes, there's no record.
But one thing those troll accounts are doing that's a little bit underreported, I think, is attacking press. And I just want to follow up on Hannity's role in this, because Hannity is, people have argued, and I think sometimes I agree with this, is he can be very anti-journalism. And sometimes he's argued, if I were at the White House, do you remember this? This was, I think, now a year ago, but if I were in the White House, I would cut off the press, or I would control what the questions were going to be, and they need to submit them ahead of time. Things that just aren't what your news division stands for. And when that happens, A, does your head explode? And then B, do you run into the front office to say, he can't be arguing against our interest as a news organization?
So let me just start by saying I made it through The View with Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar.
This is true. And I would never claim to hold a candle to them.
Joy Behar and Whoopi Goldberg trying to get me again and again to say how much I hate what Sean Hannity does. I will tell you this. One, Sean is a good guy, always been good to me. Two, he's, as I said before, a broadcaster who comes from an opinion, who obviously he's successful at his job. Three, does it cause us problems occasionally? He'll admit to you that he's the opinion page, I'm the news side. But we have different roles. And when he's saying what he's saying, we are standing up for CNN, getting access to the White House. We are, covering news, like we do, and my horse blinders are on from 6 to 7. So that's usually how I answer it. I don't go into specifics of what was said night to night, but nice job, Whoopi.
All right, I guess we'll just leave that one at that. Also, I have to get this to go a little faster because Andrea's going to take a train because she's...
And it's the last train I can take, and I've got an early assignment.
All right, so we have to make this super fast. I'm going to hit 2 reader questions and then 1 wrap-up, okay? And so one of the questions is the threats of violence against journalists. Have any of you felt endangered by anything from outside threats, from phone calls, from anything when you're out in the field?
Not since I've covered the war. Not in conflict zones, but not here at home.
Mm-hmm.
After you.
I mean, those things are always addressed. I mean, we're public figures. They're addressed by, security experts within the company. That's all I'll say,
Exactly. I don't want to give those people a lot of credit, but
Oxygen.
outside, no.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have a question from one for Andrea and one for Bret. And let me just get Bret. Respectfully, this person starts out.
It's always dangerous.
That's always a joke.
The question is, the Fox News Channel mostly presents and represents a point of view that goes against this fundamental constitutional premise of the separation between church and state in this country. Fox and its reporters continue to promote a point of view that seeks to impose the religious views of some onto the rest of us. I have a feeling you'll disagree with the premise. Through legislation and perhaps now the direction of the Supreme Court appointments and a pro-choice agenda. Do you?
No, I think we present on the news side, and frankly, I think opinion shows have done pretty balanced coverage of those issues. But on the news side especially, you know, in the Supreme Court nominees, we present pro-choice, pro-life, we present all sides, and there's no top-down order. That's the thing. There's no top-down, like you're going to cover it this way. For the news side, it's bottom-up, which is the answer.
Okay.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Andrea Mitchell.
Yeah, Andrea. Sorry to go make it straight. Yes. Yes. Does the audience understand?
No, I've got a really early assignment. I've got to get to California.
Don't worry about it.
Just read me the question.
Oh, it's a very involved question, so don't worry about it.
Oh, you're fine, Andrea.
Okay.
Is the audience okay?
Go get the train.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for coming. All right. But we're going to keep
the hardest
these two
working
on
woman in
stage
journalism.
first.
Honestly, she is the hardest working person ever. Yeah.
Okay.
Come on over.
Yeah, good. All right. So here is what we're sort of left with, though, right? I asked this. No, I didn't mean it that way.
Do you feel like chopped liver?
I could go and no,
Okay, here's what we're left
the
with.
questions that we're left with, please.
Give Nora's Andrea's question.
It's an MSNBC, why are you so negative all the time about Trump? Which I don't think either of you are equipped to answer. But here's the situation that we're left with, right? We talked about the Watergate question, but the truth is that whatever comes out of Mueller, for instance, we started going here, what can the media do to sort of help bring the country to one central set of facts when and finally something comes out of that reporting from Mueller?
I think it takes leadership in Congress, number one, both sides. For example, the Senate Intelligence Committee with Mark Warner and Richard Burr, they've worked pretty well together on this investigation. Burr has been really complimentary to Democrats, and they seem to have been, as opposed to the House Intelligence Committee, much more on the same page. You need people from both parties to come out and say, here's what we know to be true. And, you know, there has to be some leadership in the White House to be able to stomach whatever's coming. Now, for the media, the news side, I think, has its job, and it can be clear. I think it's imperative that we don't, on the news side, go into the opinion stuff and try to stick to the facts. The opinion shows are going to go ballistic. Both sides are going to go ballistic, and that's just something that's going to happen.
My concern is that it's like, and I think this is what, in some ways, if you were to spend a lot of time watching cable news, you would think the only thing that's going on in America is what's happening in the White House and with Bob Mueller.
That's exactly right.
And I think the truth is that's not the only thing that's going on in America.
So much
We
more.
We have a water crisis in many cities that is affecting disproportionately poor and minority communities. We have an education crisis in America where schools in good communities have window box air conditioning and the teachers are not paid enough. We did this morning on our show. This is the one bipartisan issue Republicans and Democrats agree on. 2/3 of Americans think teachers are not paid enough. That is a bipartisan issue. You know, we have an infrastructure crisis in this country. Our military is the greatest military in the world. I just did a piece this morning on Sarah Zorn, who is the first female commander at the Citadel. I mean, there's all these other things that are going on, and what my concern is that in the Trump era of tweeting and the Mueller, what we're lacking is depth of understanding about real problems that are affecting real Americans. And we see it in our audience research and other things that people want broader discussions. It is so important to focus on the behavior of our elected officials, but we also have, and our elected officials should also be focused on the real problems that Americans, and that's the thing I worry about, is that all the press and the questions that we ask the president and the stuff that is all focused on this one thing, we are leaving short real problems that all of us are paying taxes into the system to be fixed.
Let me just say one thing. That is, I get the most response from people on both sides of the aisle who say they are just tired of the outrage machine. They are tired of every day going to 11. They want to see what else is going on in the world. Mm-hmm. We cover this iceberg above the water that seems to be the controversy of the day. And the tweet goes out, and there's reaction to it, and we're all fish with the hook, like, here we go, for hours of talking about this thing. Meanwhile, there's a huge iceberg under the water of a lot of stuff that's happening. And we try at 6 to 7 on Special Report to look, like CBS does, at a bigger picture of other things that are going on.
So, but do you think that so to the extent that the society is very polarized right now, are we part of the problem? And can we be part of the solution?
Sure.
Yes and yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's incumbent on all of us to sort of reach beyond. I think the problems are structural, and I'm not, but if you look at a lot of the data on this, and I started covering Congress when, Rich Galen and Newt Gingrich started. There was a deliberate effort to do essentially gerrymandering, where you put, I started off as a print reporter for Roll Call, where I used to go out in districts, and there were so many districts where, the final campaign between a Republican and Democrat, it was a real match. Those don't exist anymore. The real campaigns are in the primary, right? Republican versus Republican, Democrat versus Democrat. And that's because the parties have deliberately said, we're going to gerrymander these districts all across the country. So we have red districts and we have blue districts. We're living next to people who are the same income levels of us, that look the same as us, and share the same political beliefs as us. So it is a larger problem than just that the media has created this. It's happened in a lot of because of our personal preferences, because of infrastructural problems with gerrymandering that the courts need to address, about what's been a political process. But all of that is leading all of us to say, let's just hang out with people that look like us, think like us, have the same political affiliation like us. And the truth is, we've got to try and look at other people's points of views and try and understand why they come from that point of view.
And listen.
Yeah, listen. And listen.
And literally listen.
And
because
so our role would be to highlight those different stories,
So shockingly, this panel ends on a note of optimism. I don't know how I feel about that. So I want to thank you both for coming. Thank Andrea, if she can hear me out there. And thank all of you for coming out on this rainy night.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.